It's broke, don't need a 4-heater, but you come 4 feet approach me. I'm summoning focus of Gogeta. Slight work, so imagine me chilling when folks meet up, cause my...
Welcome to the 3-Count Library, and today we're going to be discussing probably the most awaited book and the most interesting book ever done in the library thus far, and it is Tim Hornbaker's Capital Revolution, which details the early days of Capital Wrestling, the McMahon family, and the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. This book takes us from the history of the McMahon family, from their immigration to the United States from Ireland, to the birth of Hulkamania in the Northeast in 1983. It is a tremendous book. You need to buy this book. This book is key to understanding not only the McMahons, but the corporate philosophy, which kind of begins even before Vincent J Mcmahon. But it shows that promoting and it has been a family business. And we hear a lot about, the McMahons, and they've been doing this a long time. You never really realize how long the McMahons have been in the wrestling business. They've been in the wrestling business a long time. And it's a wonderful story that we can sit back and read, and it's excellent. It is an excellent book. If you can get it on Amazon, it's like $20 on Amazon. It's excellent, but it's like $18 or some change. Excellent book. If you can find it, get a physical copy of it. I made the mistake of getting an ebook. I will buy the physical copy now. So please get the book on the McMahons. As usual, we will pick 3 subjects in order to follow, and I think the 3 subjects in this book are pretty simple. It will be Jess McMahon, Vincent James McMahon, and the early days of Vincent Kennedy McMahon. So this book is going to be very good, and let's have some fun with this, man. Sit back, relax, and let's just talk about how crazy these McMahons are. And they're a crazy bunch, bro. And let's get started. Part 1 of this book begins with the McMahon family, Roderick and Elizabeth McMahon, 2 Irish immigrants coming to the United States with their 4 children in 1870. 4 children were Mary, Catherine, Edward, and Roderick J. Roderick J was nicknamed Jess. Of course, he was named after his father, but for the purpose of this book, to be quite honest, I think this is kind of how he was known in the real world anyway. He was known as Jess McMahon. So Roderick McMahon, the Jess McMahon's father, was a quote-unquote liquor dealer. I think that kind of tells you what you need to know about the McMahon family. Roderick McMahon died on October 30th, 1888. He was only 44 years old. But Roderick J Mcmahon, a.k.a. Jess, was actually a young prodigy when it comes to promoting sports. He got into baseball at the Olympic Athletic Club at only 17 years old. This was in 1900. He began managing a baseball team. In 1905, Jess and his brother Eddie started to promote boxing at a members-only club at the Olympic Athletic Club, which was illegal. It was an illegal club, and they got raided twice. They got raided in February of 1908, and they got raided again in 1909. Then they began to expand in 1910 into the Manhattan Casino, which is under the name the Empire Athletic Club. At 1930, Jess McMahon was a minority owner in a Negro baseball team, the Lincoln Giants. So I actually looked this up when I read it because I had never even heard of this before, and it is absolutely true. The McMahon family used to own a Negro baseball team. That is insane. That they was known for this. The McMahons sought to actually promote a Jack Johnson fight during the early days of Jack Johnson. So if you don't know who Jack Johnson is, maybe you're younger, you don't know that much about boxing. Jack Johnson was the first black world heavyweight champion, but he was definitely problematic. One of the things that he will always do, outside of just having a big mouth and a big ego and making fun of people, is he liked to parade around in public with white women. And this was in the early 1900s. So that they were really wanted to fuck him over. They really wanted to do him bad. Due to public criticism, however, the McMahons dropped their desire to promote a Jack Johnson fight. And they were labeled a disgrace to boxing due to illegal prize fighting and a lot of the other things that they were doing. Kind of getting it out of the mud, man. So the McMahons were trying to promote boxing. They weren't really into the wrestling business. But Jess McMahon married a woman named Rosanna McGinn at some point in his life. And he had a son, Roderick Jr., who was born June the 21st, 1910. And he had a second son named Vincent James, who was born July the 6th, 1914. And they had a daughter named Dorothy, who was born in 1916. Jess McMahon became the matchmaker for the Commonwealth Sporting Club in 1921. There he promoted boxing and started a Negro baseball team known as the Commonwealth Big Five. So he had two Negro teams. One of them was kind of a local team, and the other one was a Negro Leagues team. So these guys were really progressive for their time. Jess McMahon became a matchmaker at Madison Square Garden on October the 30th, 1925. He would resign 3 years later to work at the New York Coliseum. Eddie McMahon, who was in the business of promoting boxing along with his brother, he died in 1935. By this point, Eddie McMahon wasn't really that big of an entity in sports. 1931, Jess finally gets involved in wrestling. So in 1939, Jess McMahon started to kind of lobby against the minimum wage in wrestling. There used to be a minimum wage in wrestling, of course. He wanted the minimum wage lowered from $10 to $8 per match. So he only gets to pay $8 per match. I don't believe that minimum wage was actually lowered, but it was interesting to see that, that's really wanted. Jess McMahon was promoting concerts and different things in Washington, D.C. when Vincent J came along, and he passed the job to him in 1946. On November the 21st, 1954, Jess McMahon died of cerebral brain hemorrhage. He was 72 years old. Part 2 of this video will be about Vincent James McMahon, who was born July the 6th, 1914 to his parents, Jess McMahon and Rosanna McGinn. In 1942, Vincent J Mcmahon entered the Coast Guard. During his tour in the Coast Guard, he met a woman named Victoria, and they got married. From that union, their son, Vincent K. McMahon, was born in Moore County, North Carolina. They would later become divorced. As his father was promoting in concerts and different things like that in Washington, D.C., Vincent J. McMahon picked up the business in 1946. Knowing that Turner's Arena was sort of the heart of wrestling in the area, the D.C. area. He paid $60,000 to buy the wrestling rights from Gabe Menendez Incorporated and to sublease Turner's Arena. That made him essentially the official promoter of Washington, D.C. For just a little inflation, that would be $850,000 in today's money, in 2021 money, rather. I don't know when you're going to be listening to this. So he was the man in Washington, D.C. And he started using talent from Toots Mott's New York territory. And he also made deals with Fred Kohler out in Chicago. And in 1953, or February of 1953, he launched a boxing promotion as well. His main source, of course, was pro wrestling. And he had his issues with the NWA around this time. There were rival promoters trying to move into his territory. And he couldn't get Lou Thez to show up to help him out, which is part of the NWA bylaws. So he had a very difficult time there. So in 1955, he changed the name of Turner's Arena to the Capitol Arena. And he invested in his own money in order to launch the first TV show, which was January the 5th, 1956. He ended up scoring a long-term TV deal, which ended up being very important for his business later. Ray Fabiani was a NWA promoter from out of Philadelphia. And he was the guy who was running opposition to Vincent J. McMahon. And when Vincent J. McMahon finally was able to get Lou Thez in January of 1956, Ray Fabiani countered by bringing in Joe Louis. Yes, the former world heavyweight boxing champion, Joe Louis, who came in to wrestle Rocky Don Lee in March of that year. But McMahon's show was so popular that Dumont, which was the big TV network out of Chicago and New York, they bought the rights to his show and ran the show in New York. In November, McMahon had started running MSG revitalizing the wrestling in that area, which had been killed essentially by Toots Mondt in his really, really bad territory. Capital Wrestling officially formed in August 1st, 1957. It was a co-partnership with Vincent J Mcmahon and Toots Mondt, each of whom had 42% of 1,000 shares of Capital Wrestling. Johnny Doyle ended up with 16 shares of that promotion. So in his early days, Vincent J McMahon was a victim of the same thing that Vince K McMahon would do. Just had guys running in his town, but he was able to outcompete them by having a superior product. So even though the whole Joe Louis thing is a pretty big deal, and I think that's pretty awesome, Vince, it says a lot that the power of Vince's territory at the time was that he was able to force the guy out, even though he was willing to pay exorbitant sums of money to get Joe Louis to come in. So in 1960, two very important events happened. One, Buddy Rogers debuted in Capital Wrestling, and two, Bruno San Martino also debuted in Capital Wrestling. Interesting thing here is Bruno San Martino was 24 years old. Buddy Rogers was a little bit older. But sports writers did not like Bruno. They questioned his ability, said he was too green, said that he couldn't work, he couldn't wrestle. Dr. Jerry Graham, who, if you notice the name, he was Vince K. McMahon's favorite wrestler when he was a kid, often went on record as saying that Bruno San Martino was simply not good. And so Bruno got a lot of the criticisms that Hulk Hogan would get, and John Cena would get, and Roman Reigns would get. So it became a regular thing with the WWF and the WWE that their top guys, or the guys that they see as being incredibly talented, are not seen as being good wrestlers. So this goes all the way back to the 1960s. Literally 1960, when Bruno San Martino first came to the territory. So the McMahons was friendly with Fred Kohler in Chicago, and he helped revitalize Chicago around the same time. This is when he officially admitted into the NWA. Despite being a new member to the NWA, Vincent J. McMahon did not really follow any of the rules or any of the guidelines. He didn't submit any paperwork, and he didn't pay any dues. During the Mexico convention, however, he did show up and was able to convince the NWA to make Buddy Rogers the World Heavyweight Champion. Around this time, Toots Mondt vacated New York to run Pittsburgh, and Vince McMahon became the sole promoter out of New York. So now he's got Washington, D.C., and he's got New York. And on December the 12th, 1960, he becomes the central matchmaker for the Madison Square Garden, which is a similar job to what his dad had. So as you learning through this thing, the McMahons are no joke when it comes to promoting. It's literally in their DNA. Father and son had the same job as central matchmaker in Madison Square Garden. So Vince McMahon did a fantastic job of selling Buddy Rogers on the NWA. So on June 30th, 1961, Buddy Rogers was named the NWA World Heavyweight Champion. This gave Vincent J. McMahon full control over the bookings of the World Heavyweight Champion. And since he really was being a rogue when it comes to the NWA, he wasn't signing any paperwork, he wasn't paying any dues, he decided he's only going to send Buddy Rogers to big cities. So a lot of the smaller city promoters in the NWA hated Buddy Rogers, hated Vincent J. McMahon. What they were doing was highly irregular when it comes to the NWA. So him not paying dues, him not sending guys to their smaller promoters, it was a problem. On October 24th, 1961, Vince McMahon decided he was going to step away from the NWA. Sam Mushnick intervened and talked him into staying around, and also into trying to get him to pay dues. Vince McMahon ended up paying dues, but 15 checks were late. He sent the checks, but he sent them late. And until those checks came, of course, they had to do something to him. So what they did was they banned Buddy Rogers from certain towns until his payments were officially caught up. Around this time, Dory Funk Sr., the father of Terry Funk, who ran the Amarillo territory, really hated Buddy Rogers around this time. He was one of the smaller city promoters that really was not feeling the Buddy Rogers, Vince McMahon thing, or what they had going on. So who else wasn't feeling it? There was a lot of guys who weren't. So when Buddy Rogers was assaulted in Columbus at the Fairgrounds Coliseum in October 31st, 1962, during this attack, he was attacked by Bill Miller and Carl Gotch. backstage. He was bruised. He's had his left arm nearly broken because they slammed a door on it. They put his arm in a door and slammed it. That's how much they disliked this guy. And I'm telling you, this, when I say the NWA was the mob, this was essentially it. A lot of these guys, Bill Miller and Carl Gotch, they were officially running Outlaw. Officially, they were running Outlaw in Columbus. They were working for Jim Barnett and Johnny Doyle. If the name Johnny Doyle is familiar to you, it's because you just heard it a couple of minutes ago as a former owner of Capital Wrestling. By this point, Johnny Doyle had sold his piece of the business and was now working with Jim Barnett. Jim Barnett, of course, would become very, very, very famous for a lot of the backstabbing and double crossing that became sort of a big deal in the NWA. But Johnny Doyle and Jim Barnett wanted to take over Detroit. And Columbus was sort of seen as being one of the ways you get to Detroit. And the NWA and Vince McMahon were running Detroit. And Columbus was just, of course, that spot. So they decided to take out Buddy Rogers. When Vince McMahon complained that these guys had put a hit out on Buddy Rogers, a lot of people said that, the incident was not real. That Buddy Rogers was a really good actor. And that he was exaggerating his injuries. Of course, this did not go over very well with our pal in Washington, D.C. But he couldn't do too much about it, because in 1962, with Buddy Rogers being down with several injuries, a lot of them due to this attack that had taken place in Columbus, he started missing some dates. So Capitol fell on hard times financially. And this led Vince McMahon to finally bring in Lou Thesz. And Lou Thesz wasn't really a draw in Vince's territory, especially not in comparison to Buddy Rogers. So he's decided he was going to get out of this thing. And so what he wanted his $10,000 bond back for the title. Back in those days, you had to post a bond saying that the world champion will show up whenever he is advertised to show up. And it was a $10,000 bond. He wanted that money back. He had appealed to Sam Muchnick to get that money back. Sam Muchnick said, I will do this. I will give you a little over half of it back. So he got about $5,500 back, and was directed to tell Buddy Rogers to drop the belt to Lou Thesz, which he did on January the 24th, 1963 in Toronto. And also in 1963, the WWWA was formed. This would be Vincent J Mcmahon, Larry Atkins, and Toots Mondt. And they will begin booking what was called the Worldwide Wrestling Association. This was Vince McMahon's first attempt at a governing body, and it was incorporated under the name of Buckeye Sports Enterprises. Their territory was Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh. So he started running his own promotion, essentially under the radar, as competition to the NWA, as he was beginning to sort of field the idea. This is basically the seed that will become the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, because he sees how the NWA does business and he kind of is looking for a way out. So Vince McMahon denied that Buddy Rogers had ever lost the title, and he was able to do this because the match Buddy Rogers lost was a single fall match, and according to the NWA rules, the NWA Championship could only change hands in a 2 out of 3 falls match. So he could say Buddy Rogers technically only lost a single fall, and therefore was still the world champion. But Buddy Rogers did lose a 2 out of 3 falls match to Lou Thesz 2 weeks after that, which was his rematch clause. Vince McMahon just kind of swept that one under the rug. And so Buddy Rogers was still claimed as the champion of the world in Washington and New York. Through sheer propaganda, and because these are big media spaces, it was actually beginning to work. So Sam Muchnick once more complained to Vince McMahon that he was not paying dues. Of course, at this point, Vince McMahon is looking to get out of this thing. 1963, he forms the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. Partners in this venture were Toots Mondt and Willie Gilzenberg. Officially, I think these people were known as the president and vice president, but all decision-making, for the most part, was made by Vincent J Mcmahon. And it had been this way for a long time, that he essentially used Toots Mondt's reputation and his name to promote and to sort of use him as a figurehead. Toots Mondt, at this point in time, was considered sort of an old fuddy-duddy who wasn't really good at holding money or really good at using money, nor was he really good at creative. But he had been in that position so long and he had so many friends that Vincent J Mcmahon, it behooved Vince J to keep him there. So you see that Toussaint is a partner in all of his little ventures, but all the decision making is Vincent J Mcmahon, who he needs Toussaint essentially as his sort of godfather into the wrestling business, as a guy who had been running in the NWA for a long time, being seen as sort of his protege. But in reality, Vincent J Mcmahon is running essentially everything that they quote unquote co-promote. So as they were forming the WWWF, the WWWA still existed, and it had its own world title. And in this area, and at this point in time, different guys who were in the WWWA were starting to piece the championship off. Different guys were changing the title and giving it to different people. And Vincent J was like, what is going on with these guys? Because Fred Kohler is naming his own world champion under the WWWA banner. I think Toussaint starts to promote his own world champion under the WWWA banner. And Vincent J has Buddy Rogers as the world champion. And he's like, what is going on? Why are these guys just doing whatever they want? So there was a lot of confusion in the WWWA towns with who the champion of the world is, especially when April 21st, 1963, Buddy Rogers had a heart attack. And Vincent J started saying, oh my God, what is going on? Buddy Rogers had this heart attack, and he's still the top heavyweight in the WWWA and the WWWF. At this point, it's two separate promotions. And Vincent J was like, okay, we got to hide this from the athletic commissions. Didn't tell anybody. Kept that completely under wraps, because he knew for sure that if they found out about Buddy Rogers' heart attack, he was going to get pulled and he'd lose a ton of money. So he kept that to himself, kept that one completely under wraps. So because Buddy Rogers had this heart condition, when he was named the WWWF champion, it was a complete and total work that he had won the title in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, when in reality, Vincent J just wanted Buddy Rogers to be the champion because he knew he was a top guy, he knew he was a draw. And he spread this through the WWWA towns. He was able to first get Buddy Rogers familiar there as the world champion, because the rest of the country, they still had whoever the NWA world champion, I think it was Luthez at the time, they were still recognizing him as the world champion. But in the towns that Vincent J really was in, they started to sort of recognize Buddy Rogers as the world champion. This didn't last long, though, because on May 17th, 1963, Vincent J McMahon sort of had a conversation with Buddy Rogers, saying that, look, you need to go do the job for this Bruno kid. All right? So he sent them out there to Madison Square Garden. 19,648 people watched Bruno San Martino capture the world title from Buddy Rogers after Buddy Rogers had a heart attack. The match was about 8 seconds. Bruno San Martino won with a bear hug. Fred Kohler at this point in time decided he was going to break off from the WWWA and run his own organization, and Vince McMahon just decided he's not going to run Chicago anymore. I mean, you want to do your own thing? Do your own thing. I'm not helping you. At this point, Vince McMahon is in complete rebel mode. He refuses to recognize Thesz as the only world champion, which of course is a flagrant violation of NWA rules, but he still never left the NWA. He was, however, suspended for 1 year, and there was a lot of guys who had started their own promotions and wanted to recognize other world champions. He did so. You know, they were often a new guy would pop up and say he's the world champion, and the promoter, usually the NWA promoter of that area, would either try to squash that whole thing, but if it was the NWA promoter that was promoting another world champion, usually the NWA stepped in to do something about that. And usually they would suspend him, just like they suspended Vincent J McMahon. He was suspended for a year, but I don't think he cared. He didn't really care. Guerrilla Monsoon made his debut for the WWWF in 1963. He came in and had a run with Bruno. One of their matches drew 19,706 fans. Bruno won that match by countout. And around this time, it started becoming important that sports reporters noticed the difference between the WWWF and the NWA. And that the NWA focused on a hodgepodge of what they call a hodgepodge of technique, high-flying wrestlers, brawling, etc., while the WWWF style was larger heel opponents and mostly big fights brawls, etc. So the style that would become what Hulkamania became, what Superstar Billy Graham was, what Bill Goldberg and Undertaker and Stone Cold Steve Austin, John Cena, that style actually started to really be noticeable with Bruno. And even to a little degree, a little before Bruno, but Buddy Rogers is a little bit more technical. But the style that guys are pushing even today is the style that came from the big Bruno push. Things got a little bit dicey in the late 60s. In 1966, they one of Capitol Wrestling's TV shows in Bridgeport, New York, was canceled on April 30th, 1966. This was their main way of promoting shows to Madison Square Garden. This collapsed business. Madison Square Garden matches had to be pulled until they found a new television deal, which they did on November the 7th. They were able to get back on the air, but August 13th, 1967, that show too was canceled because wrestling was no longer in vogue. Essentially, wrestling was no longer hip, so they canceled the show. Gates immediately fell off, and there was a lot of decisions being made. And one of them was to take the title off Bruno. They were really considering around this time taking the belt off Bruno. So when business is down, Toots Mont wants out. So he's 75 years old. Now he begins to sell his shares of Capitol Wrestling. He sold 250 shares to Phil Zacco and the rest to Robert Morella, we know him as Guerrilla Monsoon. Guerrilla Monsoon would become the vice president. In return, Toots Mont got a monthly stipend, essentially a retirement. And because things had gotten so bad, in 1971, they took the title off of Bruno and gave it to Ivan Koloff on January 18th, 1971 at Madison Square Garden. They gave the belt to Pedro Morales on February the 8th, 1971, so just a couple of weeks later. They gave the belt to Pedro Morales due mostly to the popularity of Lucha Libre in the territory now, and that Bruno needed a break. They needed to give Bruno a little bit of a relaxer. Still, Bruno was a huge draw. Bruno versus Pedro, the fight of the century, was at Shea Stadium in Queens, New York. 22,508 people showed up to watch this match. The match lasted for 1 full hour and was stopped by curfew. So we had this huge babyface versus babyface match, and they decided they were not going to be a winner, so as not to piss off any of the fans. They didn't want to piss off anybody, so they decided, hey, we're going to have a draw. Smart move. Pedro was outdrawing Bruno in Madison Square Garden, but not everywhere else. Essentially, the business everywhere except Madison Square Garden had fallen off. So Pedro was also criticized for not being technically proficient enough, and so they took the belt from him. December the 1st, 1973, Stan Stasiak defeats Bruno San Martino to win the WWF World Title. This was a double pin in which Stan Stasiak got off the mat just as the 3 count landed, and to avoid the hot tempers of the Hispanic audience, it was announced as a double pin, and Pedro was not announced as having lost the title, but it ended up in the newspapers the next day that Stan Stasiak was the new world champion. And on December the 9th, 1972, they gave the belt back to Bruno. In the late 70s, things got a little weird. Vincent J Mcmahon got involved with the Inoki Muhammad Ali mixed match boondoggle. And the book tells the story that the idea was Muhammad Ali was interested in doing a wrestling thing. So it was all about them finding the right opponent and then finding the right money. First, Vincent J wanted it to be Buddy Rogers, but Buddy Rogers ended up retiring. At this point, again, he had a heart attack, just about 10 years before this. Bruno was the next choice for Ali to wrestle or fight, however that was going to go. But Ali said it wasn't going to make enough money. He was going to make about $400,000 at this point in time, and he said it wasn't enough. So then Antonio Inoki stepped up and offered him $6 million in 1976 money. That's tremendous cash. And Inoki got the match. The match took place on June 25th in the United States, June 26th in Tokyo, 1976. And the fight was broadcast through CCTV from Shea Stadium. On this same card, Andre the Giant fought Chuck Wepner, and the 15-round match was a draw and drew 32,897 fans, and is heralded as one of the worst things to have ever happened in the history of pro wrestling and in the history of boxing. It is awful. It was awful. It made a lot of money, drew a lot of money, but it was not good. And Vince J Mcmahon, and I don't think they made their money back, by the way. I think that's a huge number of fans, but I think they still lost money on the event. In 1977, Guerrilla Monsoon and Phil Sacco sold their shares of WWF to Arnold Scotland, who was a former wrestler and the manager of Bruno San Martino and Bob Backlund. So at this point in time, 1977, Vince McMahon owned 50% of the WWF. Guerrilla Monsoon and Phil Sacco both owned 20%, and Arnold Scotland owned 10%. In April of 1979, Vincent J Mcmahon sought to shorten the name of the WWF to the WWF, or the World Wrestling Federation. And that is the last name change until it was changed to WWE in 2002. For 23 years, the WWF reigned supreme as number one in sports entertainment, or something or other. But Vincent J Mcmahon died on May 27th, 1984. He was working as an advisor to his son, Vincent K. McMahon, when he passed away. So let's get us into part 3, Vincent Kennedy McMahon. On August 24th, 1945, Vincent Kennedy McMahon was born in Pinehurst, North Carolina, which lies in Moore County, North Carolina. At the age of 27, Vince McMahon becomes a commentator for the WWF All-Star Wrestling when Ray Morgan wanted a raise, and Vincent J. McMahon decided he didn't want to pay no raise. So he married Linda Edwards in 1966, and in 1971, their son Shane was born. Around this time, Vince McMahon also began promoting matches in Maine for Capital Wrestling. In 1980, February 21st, 1980, Kennedy McMahon purchased the Cape Cod Coliseum in Massachusetts for the purposes of wrestling, sports, and other concerts. This is the official formation of Titan Sports. June 5th, 1982, Vincent J. McMahon liquidated his shares of Capital Wrestling to Titan Sports. So Vincent J. McMahon owned 615 shares of Capital Wrestling. He sold those shares for $1 million. Of that $1 million, he received $822,000. The rest would be paid off within a year. Guerrilla Monsoon and Phil Sacco and Arnold Scotland were to be paid $644,000. At the time of payment, both Sacco and Guerrilla Monsoon got $71,000. Arnold Scotland got $35,000, all of which again had to be paid off by the end of the year. On June 1983, all debts were paid, and Vince McMahon owned Capital Wrestling and the World Wrestling Federation. He immediately separated from the NWA, and we all know the story from there. The title was changed from Bob Backlund to Hulk Hogan, and history was written all over again. So we can see throughout this history book, this is a great book. There's a lot of stuff in here that I didn't touch on, such as Vincent J. McMahon running a promotion that was so violent that people complained about it, and his whole answer was basically every television has a knob on it, just turn it, which is something again Vince Jr. would say when he was criticized for the Attitude Era. He would say just don't watch it. You can see that, part of the McMahon dynasty is not following traditional rules, just kind of doing your own thing out there, from, whether it's illegal prize fighting from Jess, or, hey, I'm going to run in somebody else's town, which is Vince J, or I'm not going to pay dues, I'm not going to do any of that stuff the NWA guys were doing, I'm not going to do any of that, was Vince J's thing. And Vincent K was like, I'm not going to respect territory boundaries. What good is that going to do? So there's like some serious something in the bloodstream of the McMahons that says that they know which way to go and how to find what they need. And they also did a great job of doing the generational wealth thing. You could see that Jess McMahon did a great job as a promoter. He left the business to his son, taught his son what he knew, and Vincent J was able to pick it up and go from there, take it a lot further than Jess ever did, and he stayed in one lane, which was pro wrestling. He did some boxing. Of course, he did, the mixed match thing, but he knew that his bread and butter was wrestling. And you see Vincent K. McMahon do the same thing. He went into football, he went into restaurants, he went into a lot of different industries. Because why limit yourself to only one venture? There's plenty of money out there to be made in a lot of different ventures. And that's the one thing about the McMahon family that in reading this book made me say, like, damn, it's just something in them where, Jess McMahon was a hustler, the son of immigrants. He went out there, he said, if I got to, promote baseball, then I'm promoting baseball. If it got to be boxing, then I'm going to promote boxing. I don't care if it's illegal. I don't care if it's, black people. I'm going to promote baseball if I have to. Negro leagues, black boxers, doesn't matter. Whatever it takes to not be poor. And I just want to say, you know what? I 100% support that. Because he passed that on to his son. And what, Vincent J Mcmahon was able to do with Capital Wrestling was an amazing feat. And, he was also known for using non-white athletes such as Big Cat Ernie Ladd in that territory, as a top heel. You see how admirable it is that the pursuit of success and that breaking the mold, doing something different, continuously trying, continuously hustling. There's something admirable about that. And I found that, McMahon's they are, an evil empire in terms of just, they're always the boss, even when they're among other bosses, they're the boss, and it's a very interesting thing that you see Jess McMahon was co-promoting with his brother. He's far more successful than his brother was. And you see Vincent J McMahon was in these partnerships with Tootsmont and all these other guys, and he basically was the boss. He went to the NWA where all these other guys think they're the boss. He finagled them into giving him the title, and then he was the boss. And then, of course, Vincent K. McMahon bought his dad out, and then he became the boss. So it was like they just have that knack of they want to be in control. And it's a interesting thing to see that it's a family issue. Everything that was wrong with Vince McMahon that we know, his dad had, and his grandfather had it. It's just something they passed down the family line, and it's fucking cool to read. So I should really suggest everybody picks up this book. Thank you guys for listening. Like, share, and subscribe, and I'll talk to you guys later.
Tell me what's worse than learning all that you led to believe was all horse crap. They distort so